Hello, people. I wanted to do a live because I've been listening to some discussion on psychology and whatnot, and I just had some thoughts pertaining to horses. Like, there's so much. Sorry, my seat is all messed up. There's so much with horses that we have not yet studied, and therefore people just assume that it must not exist because we haven't looked into it. Um, so the reason I wanted to do this discussion and just to say some stuff, and I'm probably going to go into more detail on this on my Patreon as I look into this further, but I wanted to talk about attachment theory and how I think that this influences reactivity in horses, because there's a lot of evidence showing how disrupted attachment influences emotional responses in humans and other mammals, and horses are a mammal. So as far as I'm concerned, they're really isn't any reason to think that this wouldn't apply to them just because it hasn't been thoroughly studied in the way that it would need to say that this is a thing. But I wanted to talk about that because weaning practices in the horse world vary quite widely, but I don't think a lot of people actually look into the long term effects of weaning and they don't consider how disrupting attachment with horses might influence their behavior into adulthood. And this could even include friendships and whatnot, but the parental figure is the biggest one. So a lot of places will do cold turkey weaning, for example, where foals will be taken away from their mom all at once, abruptly, with no slow introduction to it. So they're just, their mom's there one day and then they're gone the next. And what I want to compare this to is a study that they did on monkeys. And they took monkeys away from their mom for a couple of days, and then they tested their neurotransmitter levels and they found them to be severely impaired just by being away from their mom for a couple days. So I think it's fair to say that with horses it's likely that that would be similar because they are mammals and they use the same neurotransmitters as we do. And obviously, monkeys are more closely aligned with people, but they've also tested this in rats, for example. And the reason I wanted to bring this up is because I think that a lot of people don't consider how much the past can influence their horse's present behavior, even though horses don't like live outside of the present. But how they perceive the present is heavily influenced by past experiences. So their entire perception of the world around them is going to be shaped by prior experiences because they learn from negative experiences as flight animals. And if they didn't, they would get picked off by predators and we wouldn't have horses because they would have gone extinct before we could use them. So they learn from negative experiences and their perception of the outside world is going to change because of that. So in my opinion, a lot of the herd boundness and reactivity and stress and attachment issues we see in horses likely go back to weaning. And it could even be partially being taken away from their dam, partially when they're put out with friends after weaning, if they are, having those friends ripped away, and also the flippant way in which we just change up herds, where we'll take away horses who have built heavy attachments with one another, and their friend is there one day and gone the next. And I can only imagine how much stress that actually causes them. But horses are pretty stoic animals and they might exhibit stress in the beginning, but they're not going to necessarily exhibit chronic signals all the time or not in a way that is readily noticeable by people. And I think this is important because I think that it breeds more consideration on the parts of people rather than just assuming, oh, my horse is just being stupid. No, they could have chronic traumatic stress from having attachments disrupted at a young age. And like I'm going to use Milo as an example here. As a horse, he's really weird. He doesn't really have good social skills. He wasn't necessarily weaned early, but his attachment with his mom would have been disrupted by the fact that they were so starving. They were so emaciated. So, one, his mom wouldn't have been producing enough milk to sustain him. Two, she probably got irritated at him for trying to nurse. And three, when they were actually fed food, the few times that they were, he probably got chased off by the older horses because there was such little resources that he wasn't allowed to have it. So his attachment wouldn't have been the same. Also, when you're emaciated, you're not as physically able to do things. So, for example, mares usually groom their foals. They'll teach their foals how to groom. But when you have an emaciated horse who has no energy and they're using all of their energy just to go through the day-to-day necessities like walking to go drink water, breathing, and existing, they're not going to be putting as much time into stuff that's less necessary for survival, like grooming. So it has literally taken years of being out in social herds before Milo actually started mutual grooming. And even now, he does not do it very often. Other horses will try to groom him, and he doesn't always reciprocate. And he didn't bond with horses as readily, especially when I first got him, and especially throughout all the years that I was boarding. It was really only when we got Pogo that he actually started to have attachment with other horses, which it was, I guess, a perk in that taking him away from the herd was really easy because he didn't care. He wasn't bothered by his friends leaving. He wasn't herd bound because he didn't have attachment to them. But he wasn't able to develop the social bonds that are so crucial to horse health. And that's just one example. Like, his weaning wasn't necessarily like he wasn't torn away from his mom because he was rescued at 2 years old. So he was with his mom until he was 2 years old, but the attachment would have been disrupted by the situation. Whereas the vast majority of horses that we see in this world, even if they're not weaned completely cold turkey, they probably are not weaned in a very low stress manner. Because when you have horses being bred and bought and sold and there's revenue involved and people are trying to make money off of them, you don't always have time to do things the nice way, or people don't think that it matters enough. And we really downplay how closely horses bond with one another and how important their social bonds are. We don't actually fully sit with that because it's uncomfortable to do so. If you fully sit with how closely horses bond with one another and how it can cause them distress when those bonds are ruptured by us removing their friends or their family, it becomes really uncomfortable to look at how the horse world functions, because you have to admit to yourself that the way we do things in a lot of boarding facilities and a lot of lifestyles of horses isn't in their best interest. And this isn't, I'm not saying this to make anyone guilty, because obviously boarding situations make this very, very difficult and you can only do the best you can. But being aware of this and being aware of how it might impact your horse will allow you to help them through that easier, because you're not going to be ignoring the factors that are involved with that. If your horse gets weird after their best friend moves barns and they start acting out more, instead of getting frustrated and punishing them for it, you can look at it and go, they're missing their friend. They've had stress and trauma from their friend being taken away and not coming back. Because the other thing too is that there's enough studies now that show horses recognize each other even after being separated for years. And while they're not necessarily going to be living in the present thinking of their buddy who has left them all the time, the stress and the trauma and the difficulties from that are going to be felt internally. Because, like with people, we can have bad experiences and we can develop bad feelings and develop behaviors because of those bad experiences, even when we're not thinking about those experiences, even when we've repressed those experiences, and we have the capacity to recall the past in a way that horses cannot. But we still act out and develop behaviors that are related to things that we aren't even consciously aware of, because that is how our brains work. So I think that as an industry, one, we really need to be more mindful of how we go about weaning horses, and also how we go about moving horses around and rupturing friendships. It needs to be done with way more consideration. Two, we need to understand that when we have an industry where a lot of these very social herd animals are kept completely alone, we've disrupted attachment by not allowing them to develop social bonds in the first place. So while it can be stressful for their friends to be taken away from them, and there's a lot of situations where horse owners won't have control over that, and I get that, the answer is not just not allowing them to have social bonds, because we often disrupt attachment first at weaning, and then usually again after they've grown up and gone to training, because generally speaking, a lot of barns, once the foals are weaned, they'll at least put weanlings out with each other. Less barns will just isolate a weanling completely at the bare minimum. But then when these horses get older and they go into training, they're often kept in separate housing where they're in individual paddocks or in a stall, and their ability to interact is damaged by that. Because even with shared fence lines, they're better than nothing. Not criticizing them. If that's the best you can offer, great. It's better than not being able to touch at all. But with a shared fence line, especially if it's hot wired, they can't groom each other, they can't lay down beside each other, and they can't do these things that horses do to develop social bonds and strengthen them. And then this is where you likely will get horses who are really aggressive to other horses because they've never developed any form of attachment, and they're chronically stressed, chronically upset because they haven't been able to fulfill necessary needs, and then they act out as a result. And on top of that, they're also probably scared of interacting with other horses because they haven't learned how to socialize. So their social skills are impaired. They can't communicate with other horses as well because they were never taught that. They were taken away from their dams too young and then not allowed to exist in a herd. They haven't learned correct social skills. Because for anyone who's worked with horses who have had less social interaction, less group turnout compared to ones that have lived in herds, you can generally pick out which horses have lived in what situation, because the ones that have lived in herds and grown up in herds and haven't had to live individually at all and have developed more or less normally because of that, they respond to things differently. They are way easier at navigating conflict in a herd, and they're way less likely to cause injury. Like, I'm of the mind that a lot of the injuries that people are concerned about in having social turnout stem from horses not being properly socialized, because they blow up and they react heavily and they don't respond to things as normally. So when a horse checks them and is like, hey, I need my space, which is a normal horse response in a herd, a horse who's not used to that might view that as a huge aggressive attack and then respond accordingly. And so they have an impaired ability to judge what other horses are trying to communicate due to not having interacted with other horses very much. And again, like, I'm going to preface all of this by saying this is subjective. This is my thoughts based off of looking at research on human psychology and animal psychology. So I'm not saying that there's hard studies to prove what I say, but I'm saying that it is reasonable, evidence-based conjecture to make the assumption that horses likely experience these things, especially based off of the problems that we see in their behavior. And yeah, for anyone who has questions, feel free to ask questions and I'll get through them so long as they're not super long. But so this is something that I think that, one, needs to be studied more. And obviously, like, studies cost a lot of money. They require a lot of people to run and to do them properly. And there's also a lot of variables that would be difficult to isolate. So there's a lot of factors that could be working together to contribute to these behavioral problems. And I'm aware of that. But I think that we massively underestimate how much disrupting attachment bonds impacts behaviors, because when you look at the types of horses that are most associated with chronic stress and reactivity and explosive behavior, oftentimes they are sport horse breeds that are separated from their dams early because they're going to go to yearling sales and they're going to be used in sports. So for example, thoroughbreds, they are one of the most commonly seen breeds to develop stereotypic vices like cribbing, weaving, and stall walking and otherwise, and self-mutilation behaviors and whatnot. And they're also stereotyped as being very, very high-strung, spooky, and hot. And while a lot of this is going to be contributed to the fact that when they race, they are kept alone, and they are isolated from friends, and they're kept in small boxes. So that contributes to all of the above. But they are also usually weaned in ways that are going to be stressful, and they have attachment bonds disrupted all the time because after weaning, they're going to go into training where they're oftentimes kept individual, and then they can get claimed at races and taken away from the people and horses that they might have built some level of attachment bond with within that barn. And it happens abruptly all of a sudden, and then suddenly they have to adjust to a completely different scenario that they've not experienced, and having people handle them differently, etc., which is very stressful. So I think that there's a reason why we see certain problems showing up more in certain breeds of horses and less so in other breeds of horses. And also, being a hot-blooded breed means that they're going to be more likely to be thinkers and high-strung. But there's factors that contribute more to that by far than just the breeding, in my opinion, because it all relates to how they are frequently kept. So with horses that have separation anxiety, like, the hard thing with separation anxiety is that we validate it when we take them away or take their friends away, and they are just stressed until their friends come back or until they come back, because then basically what that teaches them is it's stressful to leave, it's scary to leave, this is uncomfortable, I don't like this, and then they only let down when they're put back with their friends. So the important thing with working on separation anxiety in specific is to only take them as far away from the herd or take their friends as far away from them as what they can reasonably handle handle and let down from and relax from. Because if they can't relax before their friend is coming back, all we are doing is validating the fact that when their friend leaves, it's very scary and uncomfortable. So that's one of the main things that I would recommend with any horse is separation anxiety. And it can literally be as infuriating and slow as, like, if they start panicking when you're putting a halter on them or their friend, that's where you would start, because it's not going to help you in the long run to just take them out and try to do whatever you want to do with them and then have them only let down from the stress when they go back. And then as for horses with aggression, a lot of those, for safety reasons, I would try to introduce them to other horses through protected contact and really make sure that, like, when they do eventually go out in a herd, that they have tons of space to get away, several different feeding areas, several different watering areas. Try to keep things out of corners so that no one can get stuck in a corner and be in a situation where they feel trapped. And then also pick and choose the herd members accordingly. Like, don't put them out with another horse that tends to be really defensive and is a resource guarding type of horse. Put them out with, like, really mellow types that are more likely to de-escalate and just, like, walk away and remove themselves from the situation. And same thing even with the shared fence line. Put them with horses that aren't going to feed into that drama and give them a reason to feel the need to be aggressive. Because if another horse hears them display or sees them display aggression and then responds with aggression, it's going to validate that experience. So that's the other thing too that plays into this, is when we have horses in really large herds on huge plots of land, or when they're living in the wild, they get to naturally choose their friends and to separate into different subgroups so that they are choosing the horses that they most closely align with and that they can have the best relationship with. And in domesticated lifestyle, oftentimes we can't do that. We can't allow them to do that. Very few barns offer this situation. So when we do put them in herds, we are the ones picking the herds for them. And there's certain personality types that are probably just always going to clash. And when you have a lot of space and enough horses for them to pair off and make their own little subgroups, that's fine, because they don't have to get along with everyone, especially when you have multiple feeding areas and multiple watering areas. They can kind of just go do their own thing and they don't have to be friends with everyone. But when you have them in smaller areas and they only have one or two friends, or like even just 4 horses out there, then they're in a situation where if there's 2 personality types that really clash, they're kind of just forced to deal with it, and that's where you're more likely to get fighting. Like, I would say space is a huge issue. Like, if you have too many horses in a small space, especially when they're not well socialized, it's way more likely to cause problems. And then also, if possible, which obviously with a lot of types of horses is going to be difficult, but if you can find their attachment history out and you can kind of learn about what might have happened to them in weaning and, like, what their lifestyle growing up was, it'll provide you further context that'll at least give you information that might be important in how to introduce them to things. Because, like, poorly socialized horses tend to be the ones that cause the most problems in the herd, because the well socialized horses look at their behavior and they're like, what is this horse doing? Like, I don't understand what they're trying to do. And they often overreact to being checked and being given distance increasing signals from horses who are used to being in herds. And sometimes when they overreact, they respond with aggression. And then the horses who are well socialized are like, wow, this horse is messed up. Also, if they are really chronically stressed, all of the other horses in the herd are going to feed off of that. And they're probably not going to like that horse very much because they're giving bad vibes to the entire herd. And they're not fun to be around because it's stressful. So there's a lot of little moving parts for this, but I think that attachment theory is something that needs to be studied further in horses, because from what we have seen in other animals, there is no reason to believe that this wouldn't apply to horses, as far as I'm concerned. And I would imagine that a lot of people in the behavioral realm who have conducted a lot of the studies that are leading the way in horse behavior research would attribute stressful weaning to a lot of different behaviors, because there are studies done on stressful weaning and, like, reactivity in horses, but they're usually short-term studies, so they'll compare how horses were weaned and then look at them again at 1 year and see how they respond to different aspects of training, and that's not very far in advance, because at as a year old they're still very juvenile. It doesn't show what they're like into adulthood. So it just depends on so many different factors, but we need to study it more, because what I find in the horse world to be so frustrating is a lot of people, until you prove something beyond a shadow of a doubt, like, even if there's a ton of evidence pointing into one direction, people want something to basically be written in neon signs and be like, this is totally 100% factual. But that's not really how science works. Science makes reasonable conjectures and then continues to look into them, and it'll change if they find out that something isn't correct. Like, there's a lot of times where research opinion has changed, and then people will take those changes as, oh, see, science is wrong, we shouldn't follow it, instead of looking at it and going, science holds itself accountable. They look into, like, scientific research looks into why things work the way they do, and when we start to see conflicting evidence that changes what we believed, then science changes as a result, which honestly is a way more responsible viewpoint than just deciding to believe what you want to believe, because people don't really look at things without bias. We tend to try to choose to believe whatever is easiest and most comfortable for us to believe, rather than what is actually true. So science eliminates bias, or does its best to eliminate bias, and it doesn't really matter if it changes, because that's just representative of how hard scientific researchers look to seek the truth, because they're willing to go back on claims previously made when information conflicts and points in another direction. And I think that's a good thing. So with horses, we haven't really had enough money put into a lot of the research that I think needs to be done. And I think a large part of the reason for that is, if this research was done and there was way more effort put into how horses feel about certain living situations, and how really normalized practices in horse management and horse training impact the horse in a bad way, it would completely disrupt the industry as we know it. So there's a lot of motivation for people to not want to research these things, and for the companies that pay for research and the big figures in the horse industry that can afford to cover the cost of these studies to not want to do that, because it would effectively disrupt the industry as we know it and force us to change how we do things if we want to maintain ethics. So I think that's a huge part of the reason why we don't see a lot of research on specific topics in the horse world, or the research that does get done and come out, if it's too controversial, it oftentimes gets buried and people don't necessarily see it. Like, a lot of the studies that have come out more recently on horses' response to bits and whether or not horses have bit lesions at the upper levels, they've done a study on event horses. They don't get shared very much. A lot of people don't even know they exist. People are of the mind that there is no evidence proving anything to be wrong with bits. And I'm not saying this because I'm anti-bit, but with the amount of evidence that we have showing that bits can be very aversive and that riders misuse them way more frequently than they think they do, there are a lot of bits that are currently on the market that should not be able to be legally sold because they cannot be used ethically, full stop. And that's a hill that I will die on. There's a lot of equipment that is currently sold to convenience the rider that impacts the horse negatively, and it's not our job to be convenienced. If you can't ride a horse without enacting pain or doing unethical things on to them, then that's on you to better yourself as a rider and to figure out what factors are making the horse difficult to control, instead of just slapping a band-aid over it and using something that's inherently aggressive and only gets an immediate response because the horse is in pain if they don't give you one. It's on us to change. It's not on the horse to tolerate discomfort for us. So I think that's something big that needs to change in the industry too. We enable people in laziness and cruelty so that they can skip a bunch of steps in training and learning how to ride, and also steps in management, or cover up for poor management by using equipment to control the horse that is difficult to handle. So for things like lip chains, gag bits, people relying completely on draw reins to ride horses who are really stressful and difficult. These are all things that usually come out of a horse who's either responding to a stressful living environment, poor management, or pain, and then people slap these gadgets on them in an attempt to control these behaviors rather than actually addressing why the behaviors exist. And there's just a very poor understanding of behavioral science and the application of it, like operant conditioning, and how it contributes to how we're training our horses. There shouldn't be a situation where it is super common for people who are charging services as a trainer to not understand the basics of operant conditioning and be able to explain it to you. But if you go to most riding school, well, maybe not most now, but a lot of riding schools, and you were to ask the trainer to describe scientifically how their training application actually works on the learner, they wouldn't be able to do it. And if you can't do that, then my question to you is, why are you training? And again, it's not to make people feel bad about themselves, because anyone is capable of learning these things. You can go and you can study these things and you can learn them. You don't even have to pay to go to school to learn them. You can do your own studying for free online. There's a lot of resources that can be used. But for people who aren't willing to do that, why are they engaging in a career that is reliant on applying behavioral science if they're not willing to learn how what they're applying actually works? And if you don't understand the application of your training process, then you can tolerate and justify just about anything. If you don't recognize the fact that the reason why your horse is way more responsive when you put a twisted wire bit in its mouth is because that bit hurts and it has a greater consequence if they don't respond, then it's easier to just shrug it off and pretend that it's a non-issue and that it doesn't impact comfort whatsoever. You can justify anything if you don't understand the processes of how you're doing things. You can justify beating the crap out of horses. You can justify using really high pressure training. You can justify putting horses into chronic states of overstress where they're explosive and reactive, and just name it as part of the process of training, which a lot of people do, which I used to do, and it's not true. My horses blow up less now, not because I have easier horses, but because I make an effort to not put them over threshold. And when they do blow up, I recognize that as a mistake on my part, that I missed something, or that something so stressful happened that they just reacted immediately and went way over threshold. But generally speaking, it's me missing earlier signs and pushing too hard and not ending the session early enough. It shouldn't be in a situation where we're so tolerant of chronic reactive stress in horses that we just label it as part of training. And it's so normalized and enabled in our community that, like, I'm sure everyone can recall, like, if you comment on a video of a horse freaking out or something, or like someone using like a lip chain or something that is inherently painful and using pain as a means of control, people will come and be like, oh, well, you've obviously not trained any horses, or you haven't trained enough horses if you don't realize that this is just a part of training. And it's like, maybe it is for you, but that's an indicator of your current skill level and your current capacity to read the horse, rather than what is normal and okay in training. Because I used to do all of the same things. I used to make the same excuses, and I used to have horses blow up on me way more in training. But that has happened substantially less since I've learned how to properly read their behavior and actually understand how the application of my training methods works and affects learning on the learner. And I can do shorter sessions now, less frequently, and see way better results because my horses are actually learning how to emotionally regulate. Whereas before, I was reliant on riding them through that stress and physically tiring them out or having them shut down, and then using that as like getting ahead in training. But then I'd perpetually have the same problems reoccurring again and again and again. And it's as easy as just holding yourself accountable, because in my opinion, I think it's very lazy, and it doesn't encourage people to better themselves if we always blame the horse for their reaction and pretend that it's inevitable and that we couldn't have prevented it. Like, the amount of people I see justifying having their horses who they're saddling for the first time blow up and go on a bronking fit frequently, and just being like, oh, it's just a rank horse. It's like, no, it's how you introduce things. That is 100% on you. And sometimes, yes, we do make mistakes. Sometimes there's factors that we miss and we don't realize, and the horse will react. So it's not where it's like, oh, you should cancel anyone who has this happen. But how they respond to what happens says everything. If they respond by blaming it on the horse and saying it's because the horse is rank, and refusing to consider that there's anything that they could have changed in their training process to make that not happen, then they're not in a learning mode. They're not looking to better themselves. If they respond with curiosity and going, I wonder why that happened. I want that to happen less. I don't want this to be a frequent occurrence in my training program. And they start to adjust their methods accordingly to try to prevent those things from happening, then they are someone that's looking to learn, grow, and better themselves. But a lot of people don't want to do that because they don't want to admit to where they have made mistakes in training, because it's inherently uncomfortable to do so. But like, we normalize horse stress and dangerous reactions in horses to a degree that literally kills people in horses. Like, I'm going to be blunt. There are so many riding injuries and deaths that are completely avoidable if we simply learned how to not put horses over threshold in the name of training, and we learned how to train them to emotionally regulate rather than just pushing on to do whatever we want at any cost. We could avoid tons of career-ending injuries for both people and horses, in addition to deaths. Those things could be avoided, and maybe not completely, but we could see a massive decrease in the safety risk of being around horses, because what makes horses most dangerous is their reactivity, but we have an industry that is not training to avoid that reactivity, that tries to frame that reactivity as inherently unavoidable, that you can't see it coming, that you can't see it happening. And the more I have delved into psychology and the science behind emotion and reactivity, the more clear it has become to me that in all species of animal, nothing comes out of nowhere. There is always something that precipitates a response. It's just a matter of whether or not we realize it, whether or not we understand what caused that response. And a lot of people aren't aware that trigger stacking is a thing, so they don't know how to add up potential triggers that would lead an animal or themselves to respond to something that typically wouldn't create a reaction. And a lot of people don't know how to read horse behavior well enough to know when their horse is going over the threshold. Since I started studying horse behavior and really looking into horse stress responses, consistently when I watch a video of someone being like, my horse did this out of nowhere, I see several signs that show that the horse is going to react before something happens. It's not out of nowhere. It's never out of nowhere. Because there's just more subtle signs. Like the horses are always tense and their eyes are wide and their neck is braced and their head is up and they're standing there. They're not moving away, but they're like flinching when the saddle goes on and they look stressed and tense. And immediately I go, I would not get on that horse. I would not be doing up the girth and saddling that horse, because that is a ticking time bomb. And people who like to stress out horses would look at someone like me and they'd call me a pussy for not wanting to do that. They'd say that I'm scared and that I can't ride well and that's why I don't want to do it. But you know what? Yeah, I am scared. I don't want to become paralyzed from a stupid mistake that I make to try to showboat to other people in the industry. I have a healthy fear of the potential for danger that horses have when they are stressed, and I'm no longer willing to put myself in situations where I'm going to increase the likelihood of injury to myself or injury to the horse. And I'm not ashamed of that, because I already have more than proven that I can ride through bronc fits and ride through sillies and horses. But that's not what good training is. Good training is avoiding those things happening in the first place. And my assets as a trainer aren't my ability to stay on a horse. It's my ability to produce emotionally sound horses who aren't likely to do stuff like that to their riders and trainers. And it's so frustrating to see what we normalize and justify in the horse industry and how it harms people, because there's so many things that are so avoidable. Like I see young riders being thrown around all the time on TikTok, and a lot of the time they don't get severely injured, so they just laugh it off and they post it, and their videos get tons of attention and people share them and they laugh at them and they get reinforced for that and think that what they've done is great. But that's how severe injuries start. You start off by normalizing dangerous situations and laughing them off and having your ability to survive dangerous situations just like create a sense of self-worth. And then you become less careful and you take pride in having these dangerous situations exist. So whether it's consciously done or not, you go about things in horseback riding that make you more likely to create these dangerous situations. And then basically what happens is, yeah, you survive dangerous situations until you don't. You don't get injured during dangerous situations until you don't. And a lot of times it's just luck. Like when I was having horses that were really reactive because I would send them over threshold, there was several times where I narrowly avoided getting kicked in the head when I'm lunging or sending off a horse who's reactive, because I didn't adequately prepare them and I missed earlier signs of stress. Narrowly avoided getting kicked in the head. And if it had connected, I would either be dead, severely brain damaged, or have had a horrible concussion. And I've also had horses almost flip over on me. If they had actually flipped all the way over, or if I hadn't noticed and jumped off in time, I could have been killed or had my back broken and had severe damage. Already there's issues with my body that are probably related to being thrown around on horses and thrown off of horses, and they're completely avoidable. So my hope is to help the industry shift the mindset away from look at all these dangerous situations that I can handle and survive to look at how I train to avoid these dangerous situations, because training does not need to be that way, and good training doesn't send horses over threshold. And I'm going to relate this to something with people, just to try to put it in perspective. And again, like a lot of people who justify this type of training with horses might be okay with this happening to their kids. But if you were sending children off to daycare or to school and they were every single day screaming and crying and very reactive and upset, like either angry, scared, sad, very high negative emotions, and it was happening every training session until they stopped reacting, would you think that is okay? Would you think that's a good state of mind to learn in? Or would you be like, that is completely unnecessary? Why is a professional who is supposed to be educating my child doing this to them? Because you should be, why is this happening? And that's the way we should look at horse training. If every time the horse comes out, they're super reactive until they eventually shut down, what we're doing is we're not actually training them to be okay with what's being done. We're training them to accept their fate and realize that they have no control over the environment, and that we're just going to continue to put them in overwhelming situations until they cease to react. And then that is how you create these ticking time bombs where horses seem to react out of nowhere, because you have effectively extinguished most of the warning signals, other than usually their eyes and their facial expression and maybe their head and neck posture. But people will punish and get rid of these signals, and then when the horse does explode, they have way less of a warning. But if you actually listen to the warnings and heed them and adjust your training to make sure the horse is comfortable before you move on to the next step, then you're not going to get those big reactions. It's the equivalent to someone punishing a dog for growling, or baring its teeth all the time, and then you get a dog that's going to snap at you and bite without any of those warnings. Do you want that? No. And I know dog people, there are trainers that definitely do that. It's stupid. You're taking away the warning signals. It's like taking the batteries out of a smoke alarm and then lighting a fire in your house and going to bed. Like that's the basic like comparison that I can make, is taking, or like freaking cutting your brakes in your car and deciding to go down a hill. Like you're setting yourself and the horse up for failure by trying to extinguish responses that effectively make clear their emotional state. And then it makes it really hard to teach them how to properly self-regulate. Like there is nothing safer than a horse who can self-regulate. And we impede their ability to learn how to do that by breaking attachment and creating stressful lifestyles in management and with how we train them. We completely deprive them of the ability to properly do that because we don't go about things correctly in training, and we constantly send horses over threshold. This is an industry-wide occurrence because it is so common that like at any level of riding, you see videos of horses panicking and freaking out, being glorified and shared all the time. You see videos of horses being reactive in their stables and being really aggressive to the horses next to them, freaking out and being upset, and people are like, ha ha ha, this is just a horse thing. Like if you look at chaotic horse compilations, the vast majority of those videos in there are horses reacting to stress. And the fact that people associate stressed horses with regular horse behavior is an absolute tragedy of the industry. We have gotten so used to seeing how stressed horses are all the time that we no longer see it for what it is, and we think that it's normal horse behavior. So we have these animals that we love that we do not actually notice their pleas for help and their expressions of discomfort, because we've come to think that these are just normal chaotic horse behaviors when they're clear indicators of stress if you really seriously look into it. And so many people are in denial of the behavioral science research because accepting it would mean admitting that most of the horses you see in your barn and your own horse are responding to stress signals, which is hard to do. But the sooner people can admit that, the sooner they can address it. Because if you're in denial of something, you're not going to properly address it. So all of my content isn't to make people feel bad, because I firmly believe anyone can make necessary change. Anyone is capable of making big changes for their horses and making a positive difference. It's just a matter of if they choose to do the work to do that. Anyone is capable of it. I don't think there's any gatekeeping of better treatment and training of horses. Everyone's capable, no matter who they are, no matter how rough and aggressive and mean they have been in horse training before. If they make the decision to make these changes and work on themselves, it is possible. So there's nothing stopping anyone from doing this as far as I'm concerned, or at least starting the journey of doing it. And what I don't like is having it be labeled as unkind to say things that are just hard for people to hear, because something being hard to hear doesn't mean that it shouldn't be said. And that just contributes to denial and ignorance in the industry. And it's not just an industry problem. This is a worldwide problem with people, where we don't want to hear things that make us feel uncomfortable, no matter how true and necessary they are. We'd rather have comfort and consistency, even if we're in denial of what's actually going on. So it's something that we just need to work on in every aspect of life, because there's a lot of stuff that we aren't aware of how it impacts us and how it impacts the animals and people around us. And there's a lot of things, like even with human mental health and human reactivity, that aren't being shared and aren't being discussed enough, that totally makes sense, because stress is expensive on the body. So it is totally reasonable to assume that chronic stress would contribute to a lot of physical health problems as well. For anyone who wants to look further into this, on like some of the reference points that I'm going to be using for the mind-body connection, in terms of like horses and other mammals, but like these references are going to be people related, I highly recommend looking and reading The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate, or When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate, or The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, I think is the author. But the Gabor Mate ones I would recommend the most. Also follow him on Instagram. He's great. He's a world-renowned psychiatrist that has done groundbreaking research about the mind-body connection, and how he attributes a lot of like autoimmune diseases and even cancers towards mental health and people repressing emotion and people not properly feeling emotion, not dealing with chronic stressors, and just pretending that it's not there, and how it contributes to the development of these diseases. And he cites a ton of studies in these books that show a very clear correlation. However, since the study of those things and accepting the validity of them would alter how we approach the pharmaceutical industry and the revenue brought in by pharmaceuticals, there hasn't been a lot of talking about that. But I highly recommend looking into it, because you might actually be able to affect change in your own physical health by altering your perception of how the mind impacts your body. And I also think the same applies to animals. So I highly recommend checking out those books, because it makes complete sense. Like, we as a entire, like, the humanity has dropped the ball on accepting how much of a role mental health plays to your entire perception of the world, and also your physical health. Like, everything occurs up here. Everything that we see and perceive, like, this is the control center of the body, and yet our world is massively in denial about the impacts of mental health, and also like mental health in general and mental disorders. We don't really accept them, and we also then don't accept the validity of that in other creatures, because we're not even admitting it to ourselves. And I think with people towards horses, that a lot of the frustration and desire for control and the punishment-based training methods stem from those people themselves unconsciously projecting the fact that they themselves did not feel heard or seen, and they weren't given a safe place in their education, their growing up, and their development as a person to learn and make mistakes and to actually feel these emotions, and they project that onto the horses that they train. And that is a hill I'll die on. I think most of the aggressive trainers that we see in the horse world have repressed emotions that they then project onto horses, because that's what I used to do, and it makes sense. Horses are a very convenient means of enacting control and getting to treat a creature in a way that wouldn't be acceptable to treat basically any other animal, including people. It makes people have an outlet for their frustration, and punishment in particular is reinforcing to the punisher, because you get to take out your frustration on another being and you feel like you have done something. So it makes you more likely to repeat it. And breaking that cycle is hard, but it's a lot easier if you accept why that cycle exists in the first place, and you start to be more conscious of your emotional state in training and handling horses. Ever since I started to do that, it has changed everything. I've had way more fun with horses. I can enjoy doing stuff with them that isn't just riding related and about producing interesting content for people. I actually get to enjoy my horses, and I actually get relaxed from it. And that didn't used to be the case. The name of the psychiatrist is Gabor Mate. It's Gabor Mate, Mate. And he's on Instagram too. I think his Instagram's Gabor Mate MD. And the books are also on Audible. That's how I listen to them because they are very long. I just listened to them while I was doing work with horses or chores around the house and stuff because then I can wander around and do things while listening. And it's very, very eye opening. And it makes total sense the further you go into it. And it has just really broadened my scope of understanding myself and also trying to make changes to make my life better. So I think that the positive thing about welcoming this type of science is that it makes you have more control over your life. You realize how much you can change just by changing the way you perceive things and changing the way you feel emotions or express emotions, and also just becoming more conscious of your emotional state, because a lot of us don't even realize when we start feeling stressed or when we start feeling angry or when we start feeling sad. We try to repress it because those emotions are inherently uncomfortable, but then it just prolongs the experience and just puts it in the background and perpetuates further stress in the long run. And the same happens to our horses. If we don't allow them an outlet for their stress, and we don't actually help them with self-regulating and doing away with that stress, then we're not helping them long term, and we're creating situations that make them more prone to injury and other problems because of that chronic stress. And this isn't to say that stress is like that there should never be any stress, because stress is not completely avoidable. Like, you can't completely eradicate stress from life. Like, even me walking downstairs and having a loud noise scare me, that's a stressor, and that's not avoidable because I can't control everything in the environment. But we should be trying to mitigate stress as much as possible when it is within our control, which a lot of times in horse training and care it is. And a lot of times with ourselves, it is. It's just about changing our perspective on things and recognizing the fact that a lot of the ways that we've been taught to handle things and a lot of the stuff that we've been taught about our emotions and how we should behave encourages repression of that, rather than learning healthy coping mechanisms and learning how to feel your emotions in a healthy way. And what I hope is that these younger generations will start to make these changes earlier and earlier, and then we'll start to see a completely different world in a few decades, because it just starts with people making the changes. It's hard to alter your path from the environment that you grew up in and what you were taught to do, be it in the horse world or outside of it, but you're capable of doing so, and I highly encourage it. So anyways, I'm going to end this, and I'll save this on IGTV, and it's also going to be on my Facebook page, Milestone Equestrian, so you can check it out there if you missed the beginning of this where we talked about attachment and horses. And then if I can save this, if I can figure a way how to download this, I'm also going to put it up on my YouTube channel. But if I can't do that, then I'm probably not going to screen record however long this thing is. But anyways, thank you for listening, and I recommend checking out those books and those resources. I've been just going through a lot of these psychology books about namely about mental health and emotions, because like it's fascinating to me to learn about the connection between emotional and physical health. And I'm going to continue doing it, because the next one I'm going to read or listen to, because I listen to audiobooks, is I forget what it's Gabor Mate's book on ADHD, and I have ADHD, and his take on ADHD is that it is trauma related, which makes sense to me, because that's also why we're seeing more cases of ADHD as time goes on, and also people are getting better at diagnosing themselves based off of new information. But anyways, that's the next one I'm going to listen to, and then I have a bunch of others that I have saved, because learning about this stuff I find fascinating. It also just makes me feel better about things that are going on in the world and just the capacity for change. So I highly recommend all of those. But yeah, I'll save this. If you want to listen to it from the beginning, it'll be on my IGTV or on my Facebook page. So thank you everyone for listening, and have a great afternoon. I hope that you all have a great day.